So welcome back again to Kilat Chaverim. Welcome back to the Sfas Emes on the Parsha. The one that we have this week, the piece that we're going to learn, is one that's very relevant always and very dear to me. And I always approach it from different sides and applications. So let's take a look. The topic is one which is sensitive and somewhat loaded. It's the question of machloket, disagreement, different approaches. Why here? So first of all, it's very worthwhile to look in the beginning of the Medrash Rabbah on Parshas Vayigash. Right, Yori could tell you about this. It's like this huge battle royal between Yehuda and Yosef. They're basically like picking up the world and throwing it at each other in the description of Vayigash Elav Yehuda. Okay, now that means that this goes beyond a personal conflict, and what's here, Yehuda and Yosef represent two very different approaches. And this is something that goes on throughout Jewish history. Even the concept of what's called Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben Yehuda, not that they're competitors, but that there are these different streams which are going. The Haftarah, which we read this week, the beautiful Haftarah, talks about joining together, right? The Israel and Yehuda, the different kingdoms that split, the Shvatim that split. So even before that culmination in this week's Parsha, we had the conflict of the brothers with Yosef. And even before that, we have the very concept of 12 Shvatim. Okay, so let's zoom out a second and see why that concept is very frightening to some people. Years ago, I read an article by an Israeli sociologist. I still remember his name because it was kind of unique. Oz Almog was his name. And he was writing about the phenomenon of Chazara b'tshuva, of Jews in Israel returning to their roots. And it wasn't just Chazara b'tshuva alone, like they were going to their family roots, that Yemenite Jews wanted to relearn and pick up again the Yemenite minhagim, and so the Moroccans and so the Iraqis, etc. Now, he said this brings back a very big problem that the founders of the state were trying to deal with. If you imagine, right, people coming, Jews coming from all over the world, Jews who'd been separated for sometimes over 1,000 years or more, who didn't really speak the same language, unless they did know Hebrew and that was their joint language. Different songs, different customs, different foods, different cultural mannerisms and such. And you want to try to make one state out of those people. How's that going to be done? The approach that they took was kind of a social engineering approach. Let's create the new Israeli. And we'll create the new Israeli almost like ice cream with mix-ins. You know, we'll take a few Ashkenazi words and foods and tachlis and latkes, and we'll mix it with the falafel and the schug, and, you know, we'll put a few things there, we'll create this new Israeli. That didn't work. And therefore, this sociologist said, there's got to be a solution to this, or else we may end up again in the era of the 12 tribes. Okay, now he spoke about that image of the 12 tribes as a nightmare scenario. As a sociologist or as a historian, that makes sense. Because if you know something about the Middle East, the conflicts that go on under the surface aren't really between countries or states. Those are artificial. Most of them were created by the British or the French, right? Lebanon and Jordan and all the different things. If the head of a particular tribe, Hamula, right, helped out the British, they said, okay, we're going to make you a country and you're the king. And that's how these different dynasties and such started. And there are bigger conflicts and little ones. Even here in Israel, sometimes there are feuds that go on between different Arab families up in the north, and every now and then someone shoots someone else because someone insulted someone's sister 400 years ago. Right? These things go on. So if you take the picture, looking at it from outside the Torah viewpoint, of a very small country, which is divided up, in which each of these tribes have their own territory, their own flag, how is that going to work? It seems like it would be a nightmare. The answer, of course, is the Torah. If you think of the tzura, of the form in which the Jewish people traveled, each tribe traveled separately, but the Torah was in the middle. With the Torah, that difference can make us richer rather than poorer. That can be a gift instead of a curse. So let's take a look now at how the Sfas Emes approaches it. He says, first of all, Be'inyan machlokes hashvatim im Yosef, when it came to the conflict, the disagreement with the tribes with Yosef, niskayim b'hem ha-mishnah machlokes lishem shamayim sofa liskayim. Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. If you have a machlokes, if you have a disagreement, if it's l'shem shamayim, if both sides, right, their intention is for Hashem's will to come out in the world in the way which is true, sofa liskayim, that machlokes will last. Now we look at that and we think, wait a second, why would we want machlokes to last? Right? Isn't machlokes a bad thing? In its most extreme form, we have the concept of lotia kekorach choladoso. One of the Taryag mitzvahs is to make sure not to be like Korach and not to be a machlokes monger. So why would we want a machlokes to last? If it's l'shem shamayim, it makes us richer. The example given in the Mishnah, the machlokes of Hillel and Shammai. Just now on Hanukkah, we learned the opinions of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai about the Neros Hanukkah, and we learned them both. Even though we paskin like Beis Hillel, and apparently the Mekubalim say it could be in the future we'll paskin like Beis Shammai, but we learn the Shita of Beis Hillel and we learn the Shita of Beis Shammai. The Sfarim about Hanukkah are full of reasons as to why Shammai said Poches v'holech, why you go from 8 to 7 to 6 to 5 to 4 to 3 to 1. Okay? And we learn that. And we're richer because of that. That's a legitimate aspect of Torah, which is there. We want them. We wouldn't want it to disappear. So he says, it's meant to be this way, l'chatchila. He says, Ki drachim miyuchadim shayla echad mehem ba'avodat Hashem yisbarach. Each shevet had their own derech, their own way in serving Hashem. You see that from the brachas in next week's parsha. Yaakov Avinu gave very specific brachas to each shevet, which really laid out in many cases their task in the building of Am Yisrael, or emphasized characteristics that they have that are necessary for the building of Am Yisrael. It's not all vanilla. They each had to be different. On a more mystical level, he says, it's meant to be as well because Yaakov Avinu represents the Torah. Okay, we've spoken in previous weeks how each of the Avos corresponds to one of the midos. If Avram is Chesed, Yitzchak Yira, Yaakov Avinu is the midah of Tiferes, also the midah of Emes, which is the midah of Torah. Yaakov Avinu represents Torah. And the Torah, right, if you're up early enough and saying your stuff and you can say Rabbi Yishmael at the end of Karbonos, so we learn that there are 13 ways to be Dorish the Torah. Okay, that corresponds to the 13 Shvatim. 13 Shvatim, I thought you said 12. Remember, Menashe and Ephraim splitting gives us 13. Okay, so he says, just as Yaakov Avinu represents the Torah, had to spread out into those Shvatim, opening the parentheses, right? It's clear it was known that that number of Shvatim were going to be, that there were going to be 12. That's why when you look at the discussions of the Imaot, Leah says, I got more than my chelik. Right? What do you mean more than your chelik? Because everyone knew there were going to be 12. Right? The Maharal speaks a lot about 12 representing this certain total expansion of something called the Yud Beis Kaveh Alachson. I'm not good at geometry, but basically it's kind of like if you have a three-dimensional cube, so you end up with like 12 lines from a center point, something like that. Okay, so that's there. And let's remember that 13 has the gematria echad, 1. Okay, so this is something which is meant to be. L'chein l'kol echad haya derech miuchad. That's why each shevet had its own derech. So let's step back a second and see how this has affected us in a positive way, okay, in the past. When we think about machlokes, we think about all the negative things that can happen and have happened from machlokes, and it's true. Rav Nebenzahl Shlita once told us, I think in the name of Reb Shlomo Zalman, that the big machlokes that happened between Reb Yaakov Emden and Reb Yonasan Eibshitz, right, this was in the 1600s, it was an intense machlokes, and he said the weakening of Judaism that happened as a result of that machlokes laid the groundwork for the reform movement to be able to spring up. Okay, now again, the people, the true people, oftentimes disagreeing, are mechavin l'shem shamayim, but oftentimes, right, it gets into the masses, and then it turns into a wrestling match, right? Which is where a lot of the negative stuff comes out. But let's look at the positive. We'll start with a mushal from the world of botany. Okay, again, I come across these different articles that sometimes open my eyes to things in Torah. People who are in America, I don't know what they're like in England. If you remember, bananas there tended to be a bit bigger and yellower than the bananas here. Okay, now that type of banana is called the Cavendish banana. Okay, there are different species of banana, as there are many, many fruits, as we'll get to in a second. That was called the Cavendish banana. The article I read a bunch of years ago was about a crisis in the world of the Cavendish banana because those were grown in plantations in South America. And at some point, there was a fungal infection that was just decimating the banana plantations in South America. And for Americans who like to have banana wheels with their cornflakes in the morning, this was a crisis. So the first response to that was to ship other bananas because there were other types of bananas, perhaps not as pretty as the Cavendish, perhaps not as sweet, but they were resistant to the fungus. And then to crossbreed those with the surviving Cavendish banana trees, therefore giving the Cavendish banana the power of resistance to the fungus as well. And once again, the Cavendish banana reigns supreme on the breakfast tables. Okay, so that shows us something in the world of botany, which is not just with bananas. Every country that respects itself keeps a living museum of all the different types of fruits and vegetables that there are. Even though most of them don't appear on the supermarket shelves. There are hundreds of types of apples in the world. We only see 4, 5, and 6 because they're prettier, they're tastier, but each of those other ones have a unique makeup and we have to save them because there are times that their ingredients become very necessary. And in the right circumstances, you want to go to those. The same thing happens with Torah. Okay, Am Yisrael has multiple approaches in Torah and Avodas Hashem. And each approach branches out into many more, even if the root is common. For example, in Hasidus, the Baal Shem Tov founded Hasidus, but then from among his Talmidim, we have huge branches which have the basics in common, but their own particular type and flavor. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter started the Musar movement. Same thing, in terms of many of those changes and difference. And even within one particular line of one Hasidus, from generation to generation, each Rebbe is not a robot who mimics the one before him. They take the basics, but their own approach to what's happening in their times and what they add becomes part of it. And that's there. So we have to realize that those branches that's spreading has given us a proliferation of Torah. And different people connect to Torah in different ways. Different people find that one thing speaks to them, but it doesn't speak to another. I've told this sometimes husbands and wives or potential husbands and wives get into a crisis because he says, oh, you got to come to this shiur, right? He's amazing. I love this shiur every week. And he schleps his fiance or something. She's like, not for me so much. Like, what am I going to do? Can we get married? Of course you can get married, right? She doesn't have to like the exact shiur that you do. You don't have to like the exact shiur she does. You have to respect each other's shiurim and to respect that there's a derech which is there. Okay, but these things are and can be unique. Let's just take for one example, right, the idea of the Sfarim of Rav Nachman of Breslov. Okay, even when I was growing up, which I used to say was not that long ago, but it's getting a lot longer ago as I go on, Breslov was a really tiny corner in the world of Judaism and even Hasidus, right? The famous Rabbi Rosenberg, who basically kind of got Breslov together in America. It was famous that he put ads in the Jewish newspapers kind of saying, does anybody here have Breslov roots? Anybody want to get together and talk about Breslov? There was nothing, right? He happened to have this connection. There was nothing there. In Eretz Yisrael, right, there was a small community, a bit in Yerushalayim, a bit in Sfas, a bit there, that pretty much kept to themselves and learned the Sfarim and did their avoda in the Breslov way, and that was it. Now, you can't go to a youth hostel in India without finding a stack of Breslov books, right? It's like, it's all over the place, and so many different people find that Torah strengthens them, especially in their initial steps if they're coming to reconnect to Judaism again. Or sometimes as they're going through difficulty, because Rav Nachman spoke very openly about dealing with the difficulties in life and dealing with the falling and getting up. And suddenly it's proliferated. Okay, so it's rich, it's there, we need it. It's not for everybody. Okay, and nobody should always be pushing something, everybody has to learn this. This is the thing, right? It's not for each person. There's a story that I thought was very beautiful, a little bit shocking, that Rav Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch, who eventually became the Rav of the city of Telz and the Rosh Hashiva of Telz, so he was originally learning in a yeshiva for younger students in Slobodka. Okay, this was not the famous Slobodka yeshiva, but there was this was in Kelm, and it was for younger students, and the Alter of Slobodka, as he was to be known then, was kind of an assistant to the Alter of Kelm, his Rebbe, and he was scouting, like you have in baseball, they scout the farm clubs and the junior baseball and such. He scouted in this yeshiva katana, and he saw that Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Leib Bloch was extremely talented, and he said, I want you to meet the Alter of Kelm. And he got him to be able to come into the yeshiva. Not only that, but in Kelm, which was really only for advanced students, there were different levels of access. When the Alter would give a shir, a shmuz, only students of this year or by invitation only could come, he got a golden ticket. He was able to go to whatever he wanted. At some point, he stopped going. Now, this caused people to start murmuring a bit, because at this time, the world of the Haskalah and other movements was infiltrating the yeshivas, and sometimes very smart, very talented students, so to speak, went off. And the idea that someone who was able to have that connection with the Alter of Kelm suddenly backed off got people to look askance. At one point, he actually banged on the stender in the base medrash. He got up, he said, I have the greatest respect for the Alter of Kelm, right? I'm like dust beneath his feet, but his way is not my way. I need another way. And he followed his Rebbeim, his Rav, and then to become his father-in-law, Reb Blazer Gordon, that tells a Rav, and then he took over from him, and he created his own particular unique form of Musar and Shmuzin, what's called the Shirei Das, that they have in the Sfarim and the Telzer yeshivas. So that's a picture of the idea of recognizing that there's greatness. Just because something's not for you doesn't mean that there's something wrong with it, and it doesn't mean something's wrong with you, right? And it's important also to be able to know what's out there, to be able to share that with people. I heard in the name of the Sfas Emes, I didn't find it inside, that when Yaakov Avinu hears that Yosef's alive, so he sends Yehuda ahead of him. He sent Yehuda, El Yosef Laharis Lefanav Goshna. He sends Yehuda to Yosef to teach before him in Goshen. Rashi says to set up a base medrash. Before Yaakov came, he wanted a spiritual center set up in Egypt. But you sent Yehuda to join Yosef and to do that? Weren't they just fighting at each other's throats? The answer was that in order to survive that Golus in Mitzrayim, said you need the different approaches available, and you need them to even be able to work side by side. Okay, this was something key that was there. An interesting example in much later history was when Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich built up the Yeshiva Torah V'das. There, he really tried to expose the students to all sorts of different things, whether within the yeshiva or without. Within the yeshiva, he had Litvish Rosh Yeshivas and people who taught Litvish Musar. He had Hasidish Rebbeim and people who were experts in Hasidus. Whenever at that time there were either rabbis visiting America from New York or rabbis who came as refugees, he took the Talmidim to see them and see if it would hit their spot. This Rebbe and that Rebbe, this Rosh Hashiva and that Rosh Hashiva. He was praised for being generous with two things that Rosh Hashivas have a hard time being generous with: donors and Talmidim. Right? If he felt that a donor should be giving to something else to get it going, He said, give to that. There was a very wealthy Sephardi businessman in America called Mr. Isaac Shalom. And Mr. Isaac Shalom approached him. He wanted to give a big donation to his yeshiva. He said, Mr. Shalom, you have to be worrying about what's happening to Sephardic Jewry. He says, I hear that in Morocco, right, the Alliance came from France and they set up schools and people are not observant as they used to be. And he set up a whole Torah network called Otzara Torah that continued on to France afterwards. It's shocking for him to be able to funnel it off like that. When Rabban Kotler came and started his yeshivas, so Shraga Feivel sent from the best Talmidim in the yeshivas. Some of the Rebbeim objected. They said, okay, you want to help them start off, send Talmidim, why are you sending them the best? He said, because they're the only ones who could understand the shiurim. Rabban's shiurim were very difficult. I have to send the best. So this idea, and the results are that you can find from the graduates in those years, Talmidim in vastly different communities. You find them in Satmar and in Lubavitch, right? And in Lakewood and in Israel and in Mojitz and in all these different places, because he said in America, they were fighting such an uphill battle. Be delighted with each Talmid who finds a legitimate Torah derech that sets his heart on fire, that speaks to him, that enables him to grow. Okay? There is certainly an inyan of following family minhagim and such, but that doesn't mean that you can't benefit and grow and join from other things, right? That's a key which is there. So this is the wealth that you can have from this, and the image of the crossbreeding as was done also exists there. It used to be that for many people, the only Torah you were exposed to was the Torah in your village. There was a rabbi in the village, he taught Torah, that was the Torah that you heard or that you knew. That was it. And now we have exposure to so many Sfarim, people, ways, recordings that you can get a taste of and draw chizuk from and do. If you take the example of Rav Dessler, who was also a product of Kelm, a real Kelm, but as he traveled and as he met different people and learned, if you look at the indices in Michtav Melio, you find quotes from Likutei Moharan, quotes from Tanya, quotes from Priya Aretz of Menachem Mendel Vitebsk, and he joined those things together, okay, because this is what we need in our times as well to be able to do and see it. Now again, we're talking about legitimate Torah approaches, and that's sometimes where the fighting comes on where the boundaries of that legitimacy is, okay, but that is something that it has to be something that is recognized, that sticks to the basics of the Jewish Ani Mamin, of the Shulchan Aruch, and of the Masorah, right, in order to be, so to speak, on the table as one of those. Now the Sfas Emes goes on to show that this is actually in the very nature of Torah. He says, Matzinu she'Torah nikras eish. Torah is called fire. A pasuk in Yirmiyahu, kol devarei ka'esh. But Torah is also called water. Okay, dichsiv, as it says, kol tzamei l'chul hamayim. Every thirsty person should go to the water. And the Mepharshim say that refers to Torah. Yosef HaTzadik, his way in Avodas Hashem was Eish. As it says in Ovadia, Beis Yosef Lahava. Yosef was a flame. That was the only way he could have survived the way he did in Egypt. He was one, he was alone, with all of the forces of Egypt against him. From Eshes Potiphar to who knows what else. How can a person remain strong in that? If you're on fire. He says that he had this incredible self-confidence. Vayigba libo b'darchei Hashem. His heart was raised up in the pathways of Hashem. Right? You can't mess with me. You have no idea who I am, what I am. I'm beyond, right, what and where you come from. Yehuda is bechinas mayim. Yehuda represents the water aspect of Torah, which is the idea of submissiveness. Tefillah, he says, lishpoch lev kamayim, to pour out your heart. David HaMelech, that king from Yehuda, in his Tilim, who cries to Hashem, who even talks about his own shortcomings. Anochi tolas v'lo ish, I'm a worm and not a person. Okay, so he says, they say, kind of a joke that somebody at a time of Machlokas said, why did David HaMelech say, Anochi tolas v'lo ish, I'm a worm and not a person? He says, because from Jews are very careful not to eat worms, but they're not careful about eating people, right? I'd rather be a worm so they wouldn't eat me up. Okay, so he says, right, this is water always travels to the lowest point. So which is it? Are you supposed to be on fire in Vayigba Libo in Torah? Are you supposed to be this humble Mayim type? It depends. Certain people have the Tchunas HaNefesh, the spiritual buildup that leads them one way. Certain circumstances require them to be a certain way. Okay, and that's what we have. Now here he takes it to another fascinating plane. He says, Be'emes, Klal Yisrael tzarich lios kol hakochos elu. Am Yisrael needs all of these. V'hashleimus bo yedei kol hamidos. And the wholeness of Am Yisrael comes from all of these. Okay, it's fascinating that the Imre Emes, the Ger Rebbe in Poland, who had a very different community than the community of Rav Hirsch in Frankfurt in Germany, he said that what Rav Hirsch was in Germany was like what the Kotzker was in Poland. Okay, meaning that wasn't the Ger Rebbe's way of Avodas Hashem, but he was able to recognize the importance of Rav Hirsch's way of doing it and what he accomplished with it. Okay, that's the way we have to approach this idea of difference. Now here he gets into our world inside. We also have machlokas going on all the time inside of ourselves because we also have different midos. When you bump into a situation, you have the machlokas. Part of you wants to get angry or say something strong. Part of you wants to make peace. Part of you has pity and mercy. Part of you, right, is standing up for principle. And you don't know what to do in this machlokas. A person has to be able to draw from the Torah the guidance to know which midah is applied in which way, in which circumstance. Rav Wolbe used a beautiful phrase describing this. He says that a person has to be a lamdan when it comes to midas. What's meant in yeshiva when you say that a person's a lamdan? A lamdan knows how to make fine distinctions. Okay, a lot of the yeshiva lamdas, what's called, goes on where you see, wait a second, these cases seem similar. Why does the Gemara treat this one differently than the other? Why does the Rambam treat this one differently than the other? And you learn to make the distinction, wait a second, there is a subtle difference between them and that can account for it. So he said, in the same way, when you're looking at a situation, you have to know which midah to use or which mix of midahs to use in which extent. There's a story that I always tell to illustrate this. It was brought, there's a beautiful collection that they made, Meir Eni Yisrael, trying to collect first-hand accounts of people who interacted with the Chofetz Chaim. It's a 5-volume set. It's got fabulous things in there. And this story was told by Reb Elia Lopian. Reb Elia Lopian was also a Talmid of Kelm. He had a yeshiva in Russia for a time, then he was in England, and eventually became the Mashgiach, the yeshiva in Kfar Hasidim near Haifa. Now, he said when his yeshiva was in Russia, so the mayor of the town was a communist and a Jew. Okay, that was not uncommon in the beginnings of communism. Some of the most active leaders in communism were Jewish, right? Trotsky being the most famous one. But many Jews were swept away with the idea that communism would first of all save them from the oppression of Tsarist Russia and give them equal rights like everyone else and stop so much of the bad stuff that was going on. However, communism also believed that religion, not just Judaism, but all religion, should be eliminated. They called it the opiate of the masses, right? Because Marx was always scratching his head wondering, how is it you can have all these gazillions of workers working away for minimal wage under horrible conditions, and a few people on top are making all the money? Why don't these guys get together, go to the boss's house, bop him on the head, and say, it's now our factory? Why aren't they doing the revolution? So part of what he blamed was religion. He said the priests, the rabbis, they all tell him, don't worry about this world. In the next world, you'll be having a good time, and all these things, just go through with it, etc. He said it puts them to sleep. Now, they chose Jews to work on eliminating Judaism because they know how to do it best. So Reb Elia was surprised that the mayor of the town, even though he was a communist and he had a position of power, he treated the yeshiva well. There were no problems. At some point he got to meet him and he said, I just have to ask you, I'm curious. You're a communist. Why is it you're letting us be? And I'll tell you my story. He said, I grew up in a religious home and my parents wanted to send me to yeshiva. And I was also okay with that. I was smart. I learned well. I liked learning. They sent me to the yeshiva in Radin, yeshiva the Chofetz Chaim, to be interviewed. My first interview was with the Chofetz Chaim's son-in-law. He tested me on what I was learning. I did well. But I told him, I said, I want to be honest with you. I'm a member of the party. I'm a member of the Communist Party. I believe in communism. And that's not going to change. I didn't want to fool you. I just wanted that on the table. He said, if so, I think you have to speak with my father-in-law, with the Chofetz Chaim. So he took me into a room, sat me down across from the Chofetz Chaim. Same discussion. And the Chofetz Chaim said, I'm sorry, we can't have you in the yeshiva. He said, someone who would believe in communism to the extent that you do would missionize for communism. You would destroy the yeshiva. You can't be in the yeshiva. So the man said, I told the Chofetz Chaim, okay, I was honest with you, you're honest with me, no hard feelings. I just have one problem. He said, there are no trains out of Radin tonight. What am I going to do? So the Chofetz Chaim said, you'll come to me. And he took him home, and he made him supper, and he made him a bed. And then the man said in the middle of the night, he woke up, he heard somebody walking softly in the room, and he saw the Chofetz Chaim take an extra blanket and cover him over. He said, that was where I thought I saw that it was real and that it was true. And that's why I treat you the way I do. So if you analyze this story, you have to see the following. You see that the Chofetz Chaim, on one hand, used the midah of strength and protectiveness. He had to protect the yeshiva. He had to reject this student from coming to the yeshiva. But we usually tend to paint everything black or everything white. Once we've identified someone as a menace to us or our way of life, that's it. Out on the street, freeze for all I care. No, that midah has its place. But you're also my brother, you're my fellow Jew. You need a place to stay. You need supper. You need a bed to sleep in. Come to me. Not only that, I don't want you to be cold and uncomfortable. I want you to have an extra blanket. This is the idea of utilizing the different midos, each one in the appropriate measure, in the appropriate place, in the appropriate way. All of the midos we have are for the good. This is what the Sfas Emes says. He says that every midah that we have, bevadai kulam shavim l'tova. All of our midos are equally good. You just have to know when, where, and how to use them. You should never cut off a part of yourself. Every part of yourself, of your character, of your aspect, all are there and can be used in the good and right way. You just have to know how to do it. If we can put all these things together, if we can learn to appreciate legitimate approaches of Torah that are different than mine, if we can learn to take aspects from other ways of Avodas Hashem that can enrich my Avodas Hashem, if we can say, that's not my way, but I'm not saying that it's bad because it's not my way. And if we could have that, then that would be the picture of the unity that comes about with the Echad, with that 13, which is Echad. And if you would mix in that, if we would know how to work our midos in the right way, and be lamdonim, and know how to apply them, and not paint everything as all bad or all good, or react in the wrong ways, so then we'd be able to live our ways of different Avodas Hashem in peace and harmony, and all become richer and better with that. That's what's happening here with this. That's the picture. And as you read the Haftarah on Shabbos, take a look and you'll see that that's really the picture of our future. At some point we're going to get it right. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful week, a wonderful Shabbos.